Well, so far we've taken a detailed look at the body from the neck down, and as a professional, I did this on purpose because most of us tend to focus on the face and we tend to ignore the rest of the body. We often miss what the feet are telling us, we often miss what the torso's telling us, we often even miss what the neck has to tell us. So now I want to go into that area of the body which we're probably most familiar with, and that is the face. By now you realize that as a professional observer, I'm not just content with looking at the face in its totality. And you're absolutely right. As a professional, I divide up the face because different parts of the face tell us different information. So I want you to picture a face. Perhaps you can look at someone that's standing nearby, or maybe even look in the mirror. That's often useful. And look at it the way that I have taught FBI agents to look at the face, and that is by dividing it up into different parts. And the first part I want you to look at is the forehead. What is it that the forehead can teach us about how we feel? And maybe what we're thinking, perhaps even intending. The second area I want you to focus on is the eyes. And there's a lot of information that has been written over the years about the eyes. The eyes as the portals and windows to our souls. The eyes as true reflectors of our emotions. I want you to look at the eyes the way that I look at the eyes and say, what does the science tell us? What does the science tell us about the eyes that we can use day to day so that we can cut out those things which are anecdotal, those things which are passed on from person to person, but really don't reflect what the science tells us about the eyes? I then want you to think about the nose. And many of you are saying, come on, you're kidding. Is there anything in the nose? And absolutely, there are some things about the nose which can give us a lot of information. I then want you to picture the mouth, the whole area of the mouth, and say, here is one area of the face, independent of other areas of the face, which can give us rich information in real time as to what this person is thinking and feeling. And then I want you to think about the jaws and the chin and how this area of the face, which is very muscular, very robust, because obviously it's used for chewing and biting and speaking, and how that possibly can give us information. So as you can see, the face is a large canvas. It's a place where we can collect a lot of information, but we can only do that if we parse the face into these separate parts, realizing that they will all speak to us, that they will all communicate to us information, if we will take the time to look at it closely and examine these areas of the face, all independent of each other, and then collectively to determine in context what this person may be feeling, thinking, or intending. I don't think you need me to tell you that quite often the forehead is one of the easiest places on the body to determine anxiety. You see someone under stress, you see someone who is in pain, you see someone who may be suffering, you see someone who is emotionally distraught. And quite often, right there, for everybody to see, it manifests on the forehead. Anthropologists and biologists think that there's a very simple reason for this. As I've stated previously, for tens of thousands of years, we have communicated non-verbally. And from birth, we sought information about the well-being and status of our children. And as a mother quickly learns, one of the fastest ways to determine whether a child is comfortable or uncomfortable, going back to the paradigm that we've been talking about all along, was to look at the facial features, but in particular, the forehead. The forehead is one of those areas of the bodies that in real time presents us with a very accurate picture as to a person's thoughts and feelings. It very easily, very clearly can show us when there is stress, when there is comfort, when things are not going the right way, when something is troubling us. And while it is true that the feet are the most accurate, non-deceptive part of our bodies, it is also true that our foreheads are fairly good indicators of our state of mind and our state of well-being. One of the things that physicians look for when people come in and are asking for pain medications is, how does that forehead present? Because the person that is truly in pain, the person who is truly suffering, will quite readily manifest that information through the forehead, which, if you can visualize, has many ways of showing this. We have the wrinkled forehead, we have the crinkled forehead, we have the painful looking forehead. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see this on someone as young as several hours old to those who are now in their 50s and their 60s and have a lifetime of worry lines on their forehead, who have a lifetime of worry and concerns and problems. And you see these very strong lines in the forehead, which have been used so often to reflect how they feel, that they have carved permanent features on that forehead which never go away, are always with us, and therefore are always reliable as indicators of how we feel. So one of the things that we focus on when we first meet someone, when we first deal with someone, as we assess for comfort and discomfort, is to look upon them and see, what does the forehead tell us? Never mind what they're saying, but are we seeing any indications of stress on their forehead? Why? Because we know that this is one of the areas where the limbic brain registers emotions. It tends to be highly accurate, highly truthful, and most of us are not very good at concealing how we feel, what we're thinking, and so forth with our foreheads. And that's why sometimes a person is asked a question and they'll say, well, thank you very much for asking that question. And you see their forehead indicating the distress that they are undergoing or the dislike that they're processing as it registers in their foreheads. So we look for comfort and discomfort here because of its speed and its accessibility. It may be tough to see the feet, it may be tough to see the hands, but the forehead is right there for you, and it's talking to you in real time. And I have been in many a meeting where, as the flow of conversation goes over time, how we feel at any particular moment is clearly reflected in our foreheads. So this is one area that I want you to think about and remind yourselves that because our limbic brain is hardwired to reflect our emotions, this is one of those primary areas that we should focus on because it has served us for tens of thousands of years. Because once again, when that baby is born, it really only has a few ways of communicating that which we seek constantly, comfort and discomfort. And it shows so clearly on the human forehead. Our forehead's ability to communicate information isn't just for us humans. In fact, furrow your forehead sometime around a dog, and what you'll notice is that even dogs can read our foreheads, and they'll respond to this message that something is not well. Now, we've talked about pacifying behaviors. And one of the areas where we see a lot of pacifying behaviors is precisely there on the forehead. We see a lot of hand to forehead touching. You'll see people rubbing the temples of their forehead. You'll see massaging of the forehead, scratching of the forehead, rubbing of the forehead with two hands. Sometimes even people will bury their forehead into their hands as they're trying to deal with stress or distress. So the forehead serves two purposes, really. Number one, it's a good place to look for signs of comfort and discomfort. And obviously, when we're comfortable, our foreheads are relaxed. There aren't a lot of stress lines, and even if there are some existing ones, because of our age, they tend to be relaxed and pliable. So we can look for signs of anxiety and distress there, but we can also look for signs of pacifying, because quite often we humans use this area of our heads to pacify ourselves. Now, sometimes it's so severe, and I'm sure you've seen people that have a very bad headache. I mean, they're under so much stress that they're literally burdened with this huge headache, and they're rubbing their forehead and so forth. And this is a true indicator that they're going through something quite severe. And so when we see the small child who should not have a lot of stress in his life, or the little girl who comes in from playing and you see a little bit of distress on the forehead and they're touching their forehead and so forth, you can tell yourself, I'm seeing two things here, two distinct things. I'm seeing the indicators of distress. I'm seeing the indicators of anxiety, perhaps. And I'm also seeing the pacifiers. So now we have more information. They don't have to tell us verbally that they're going through something. We can see it, and we can immediately act on it. Many of us in society are very private. How comforting it is to know that someone with this knowledge can reach out and comfort us, can reach out and say something to us that will assuage those concerns. And it's a wonderful thing. And it's not just for children. In the workplace, when you're dealing with human resource issues, to walk by a desk and see someone who is struggling with something, and you can immediately pick up on it because now you know the secret. Now you know that by looking at the forehead, seeing the distress there, and seeing the hand to forehead action, which is a pacifier, you know that there's something significant. And maybe this is an opportunity for you to lend a hand and to help your fellow worker out. We talked earlier about head tilt. And one of the things that happens when we're under stress, when we are suffering from anxiety, is that really our limbic brain doesn't permit us to tilt our head as we normally would when we are listening to something that we enjoy, or watching something we enjoy, or being around someone in whom we take delight. And this is part of the way that we communicate this anxiety. And so we may see a collection of things associated with stress on the face. We may see the furrowed eyebrow. We may see the stress lines on the forehead. But connected with that is the tension that we'll see descending from the forehead all the way down to the neck. And so it's not unusual when someone goes to a massage therapist for them to comment, "Oh, your neck is so stiff. I could see that you were stressed the minute you walked in." Well, the reason they know this is because of this connection that we have, which involves the muscles. So the tension that we see on the forehead will actually descend down into the neck muscles and into the shoulder areas. And so when we touch these areas and massage these areas, we sense the tension. And I say this at this moment because I've divided the body up into different sections. But we need to remember that our body is connected by muscles, by nerves, and so forth. And so what we see in the forehead will be relayed on down into other parts of the body. And so we may see that same tension in the face and in the neck and elsewhere. Descending down from the forehead, I now want to concentrate on the eyes. I want you to think of the eyes, but I want you to view the eyes in a different way. Unfortunately, a lot of misinformation over the years has been written about the eyes and what the eyes can tell us about what's going on in the brain. So I'm going to share some things with you about the eyes that maybe you've never thought about. And I'm also going to clear up some of the misinformation that's out there. And I want you to look at the eyes as I see the eyes from a scientific standpoint as a way to assess what an individual is feeling, thinking, or intending. But to do so, we have to start with a clean slate. Our eyes are the primary means by which we receive information. And I know that over the years people have taught us that some of us like to feel and some of us like to hear and some of us like to do this and that. And the bottom line is this: when it comes to the eyes, it's the primary way we receive information. How do we know that? Well, first of all, you have the optic nerve. And second of all, you have this huge area in the back of the brain called the visual cortex. And as any anatomist will tell you, in relative size, the visual cortex is huge. That means it's designed to collect information in bright light, in low light. The visual cortex, in conjunction with the eyes, permit us to collect an extraordinary amount of information about color, about light, about shades. And this information is then passed on to other parts of the brain so that we can process that information. We can see the beauty of the flower. We can see the texture of the flower. We can see the depth of field between the edge of the leaf and the center of the flower. And the eyes can also see that which is moving slow and fast, and they can also detect danger. Now, this is quite a bit of information that's being gathered, and that's why our visual cortex is so large. Our eyes, therefore, not only collect a lot of information and process a lot of input, or at least are involved in that process, but interestingly enough, our eyes also reflect a lot of the activity that's going on inside the brain. And I'll give you an example. Someone comes up to you and says, "I'd like for you to help me move this weekend." And all of a sudden you find yourself covering your eyes with your fingers and taking a second to respond, and then you say, "I'll be happy to." And you ask yourself, because you are now an observer of the human form, why did I just cover my eyes? Well, the covering of the eyes is actually a blocking mechanism. And we don't realize it because we often blink. But most of the time when we hear something we don't like, we actually close our eyes. Sometimes it's just for a tenth of a second. Sometimes it's for a little longer. But one of the ways that the human brain found to protect itself is to use this blocking mechanism. And so many times when we hear bad news or we are being told of something that stresses us, you'll find yourself closing your eyes as you are processing this information. Now, some of you are clever and you're asking yourself, wait a minute, why is it that we're closing our eyes or blocking our eyes when we're hearing this information? Well, no one is quite sure why, but here's a fascinating fact. This is so hardwired in us. This is part of what we call our paleo circuits, our ancient circuits. These are millions of years old. That children who are born blind, they've never been able to see, will often cover their eyes when they hear something they don't like. This means that for tens of thousands of years, even millions of years, we developed a system by which we could blot out the world through the primary means of gathering information, the eyes, by closing our eyes, covering our eyes, or protecting our eyes to the point where even when we don't see, even when we're blind, we will cover the eyes when we hear things we don't like. So for us who observe human behavior, we can look upon the eyes as a locus, a place we can go to tell us when someone is showing discomfort over something they're looking at, something they are hearing, or perhaps even because of something they are thinking. I remember years ago, I had taken some action in an FBI operation, and as I'm driving back after it was all over, I started to think, well, you know what? I don't think I searched the roof of that house. And I found myself pulling over with another agent, sitting in the car for a minute, and he's looking at me and he's saying, "What's the matter?" And I found myself with my hand covering my eyes as I'm processing this information. And it was a reminder to me that as I am having these negative thoughts, that a potential suspect, a dangerous individual, may get away because of my failure to have searched the roof of this house, affected me in such a way that I was actually blocking out everything else that is around me. So I say this because we often look at the eyes and we seek information from there, but we haven't really been taught what is accurate information that we can find from the eyes. And this is one of these. So we look for any gestures, any behaviors in the eyes which are blocking behaviors. And those can manifest in a variety of ways, where the eyelids come down and remain low for a long period of time, where the person literally covers their eyes with their hands, or what is often mistaken, and I used to see this a lot in interviews, where I ask a suspect a particular question and immediately they begin to rub their eyes with their fingers. Now, most people think, oh, well, maybe his eyes are dry and so forth, and that may be true. But in this instance, the act of covering the eyes, of touching the eyes, comes immediately after the stimulus, and that stimulus was my question, which then says to me, they didn't or he didn't like that question. So I want you to begin to look at the eyes in this way and say to yourself, yes, this is how we primarily gather information, but it's also one of the ways that we have of transmitting information to others without saying a word. Over and over, I've talked about the limbic system and the elegance of the limbic system in communicating in real time our thoughts and our emotions. One of the things that's fascinating about the eyes is how it responds in literally milliseconds to the world around us. The research tells us, and this is an experiment you can do at home, that when you see something you like, you see something you enjoy, your pupils dilate. You have absolutely no control over this. None. If I were to show you a picture of a beautiful woman or a picture of a very handsome man, your pupils would dilate. Now, some of you might say, well, that's because of social conditioning and so forth. Well, that's what we used to think. So in the 1980s, some experimenters decided, well, we're going to do this with babies. And so they decided to show children that were 3 weeks, 4 weeks old, pictures of their mothers, pictures of beautiful models, and then pictures of just average-looking people. And here's what they found, that we do, as a species, have a preference for beauty. And so when the babies were shown a picture of their mothers, their eyes widened, their pupils dilated. When they were shown pictures of just an average-looking person, their pupils and their eyes were unmoved. And then when they were shown the pictures of a beautiful model, their pupils fully dilated. And not just that, but babies engaged in greater gaze time. In other words, they wanted to look at these pictures even longer. Now, this is something over which we really don't have control. You really can't say to your pupils, hey, dilate for me. And you see this in courtship. You walk into a room and you see someone that is immediately attracted to you. And one of the things that happens is your pupils dilate. Now, the person that you're looking at, who is looking back at you, they may not realize what's going on. They may just sense that something positive has just taken place. And what in fact has taken place is that in a very quick moment, your pupils dilated, your eyes relaxed, and this has registered subconsciously. In the same way that when we look at a baby and the baby stares back at us, that relaxed face that we show is mimicked by the baby and is transmitted back to us. So our eyes dilate when we see things that we like. And in fact, the muscles around the orbits of the eyes relax. And so the opposite is true. When we see something we don't like, or something that may potentially threaten us, our pupils constrict and the orbits of the eyes get smaller. Picture the actor Clint Eastwood in some of those so-called spaghetti westerns that he did many years ago. And they're getting ready to draw down on each other. The one thing you never saw was big, wide-open eyes. What was it that we saw? We saw a lot of squinting. And this is one of the things that our eyes do, is that when there's any kind of discomfort, when we see something we don't like, when we see something that threatens us, our pupils tend to constrict, and the orbits of the eyes tend to tense up, and we therefore squint. Now, this serves multiple purposes. By closing the orbits of our eyes and creating small slits through which we see, we're actually protecting the eyes from harm in case something is thrown at us or something tries to grab us. But there's another feature that's fascinating, and most photographers know this. The smaller the aperture, the greater the depth of field. So think about it. When you see something that's a potential threat, or something that's potentially dangerous, or you see someone you don't particularly care for, your limbic brain, in an instant, shuts down that pupil so that everything in front of you becomes crystal clear, so that escape and evasion can take place with clarity. Things become more perfect by the closing of the pupils. And this is one of those mechanisms that for millions of years has served to help us, to protect us, to keep us alive as a species. And you often hear about, certainly in my profession, I heard about police officers in shootouts. But you often hear about individuals who have been in accidents, and they talk about tunnel vision. So we have this magical aperture called the pupil, which will immediately begin to make itself small so that we can see with greater clarity. And you say to yourself, well, that's nice, but how do we use this? Well, what often happens is you walk into a room and you run into people you haven't seen in a while. And maybe you run into someone who you've had words with before, or there is some issue that is unresolved. And you pick up on this immediately because as you enter into the room, you notice that while everybody else's eyes remained open and wide, this individual's eyes suddenly squint. And this is a true reflection of the sentiments that are still there. You are the stimulus. You have just walked into the room. Their reaction to you is to squint ever so slightly. And in doing so, they're revealing to you exactly what they're still feeling. Now, obviously, a person who squints when they look at a document because they have poor vision and so forth, that's something else. But as I've stated before, what we look for is the reaction to some sort of activity, the reaction to some sort of stimulus. And so your presence in that room, and all of a sudden this individual begins to squint at you, is really revealing as to how they really feel. And you say, well, how else could I use this? So I want to give you an example of an actual case where I used eye behavior in furtherance of an FBI investigation. It was an espionage case where I actually used eye behavior to identify individuals involved in espionage. In the late 1980s, at the height of the Cold War, an individual who had served in the U.S. Army came under investigation by the FBI and the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command. At the time, I was the primary FBI investigator assigned to this case. And over a period of 50 interviews with this individual, who was not under arrest and who knew I was an FBI agent, he provided us information as to his espionage activities, knowing full well that in the end, if he cooperated with us, this would help him eventually when he was sentenced. During the interview process, he revealed information which was extremely disconcerting. And what he revealed was that he had obtained classified information at the top secret code word level, which could compromise the security of all NATO forces in Central Europe. Obviously, this was something that had to be dealt with and had to be dealt with quickly because of the danger that existed at that time. As he told his story, it immediately became clear that the information that he had possessed and passed on had come from other sources, indicating that, unbeknownst to us, the intelligence community, other people had been involved. And so there came a point where he was confronted by me, and he was asked who else was involved. And he responded, I'm not going to tell you because I know I'm going to jail, but I don't want them to go to jail. And so we were faced with a dilemma. Here's an individual who has information which would benefit our investigation, but now is reluctant to provide that information. So how do we get it out of him? Well, we don't torture, we don't hurt people. We have to abide by the laws of the land. And so it was decided that one of the ways we could learn this information was using the precise techniques that I have been teaching for years in reading nonverbal communications. So with the assistance of several individuals, we put together a list of 32 potential people that could have been involved. And so we sat with this individual and we showed him on 3x5 cards the names of each one of these individuals that had worked with him. Now, we didn't ask him if they were involved. We didn't ask him if they were guilty. We didn't ask him if they had committed espionage. Our only question was, Can you tell me something about the personalities of these individuals? And as we flashed each and every card, unbeknownst to him, we were looking at his eye behavior. And on 2 of those cards, his pupils constricted and his eyes squinted. Now, we didn't say anything to him at the time. Several days later, when we had identified fully these 2 individuals, we went back to our main subject and we said, tell me about X and tell me about Y. And his eyes got as big as saucers. And he said, how did you know about them? To which we replied, do you think you're the only one that's talking to us? And at that moment, he told us everything about them. We then went out, identified these individuals, interviewed these individuals, and they independently confessed to their involvement in espionage. And incidentally, they each got 18 years. The principal subject got 36 years. Now here's a case where we used eye behavior to identify not truth, not deception, but to identify for us that which would cause this individual harm. His 2 conspirators and his pupils reflected that information because out of the 32 cards, there were 2 individuals that were a potential threat to him. And true to form, his limbic system recognized the threat, and pro forma, the pupils constricted at that very instant he saw those names, even though he was not sure what exactly it was that we were doing. And so here's a case where we take this intimate knowledge of human behavior and we use it to further our inquiry and do so unobtrusively without this individual ever really knowing what it was that we were observing. And we received that information through his voluntariness and in real time. So as you can see, the eyes can tell us a lot of information. They dilate when we're happy, they dilate when we see something we like, they constrict when we don't. Now, over the years, there has been some misinformation written about our eyes and deception. And I say misinformation because when this was first written about, there was a theoretical model that was suggested. And the model was simply this, that as we process information, some of us have preferences for looking up and to the left, some of us have preferences for looking up and to the right, down and to the left, down and to the right. And some of this information, which was anecdotal, not research-based, was taken, sometimes abducted by observers and used to justify explanations for whether or not someone was being deceptive or someone was telling the truth. I can tell you this, that as of this date, there is no conclusive evidence, there is no conclusive research to suggest that any particular eye behavior is indicative of truth or deception. And while it is true that some people will look in a certain direction or another direction as they process information, and this may be their baseline for that, we must never forget that there may be intruding thoughts which interfere with that, which alter that behavior. And in doing so, changes the observation and thus changes the experiment. Well, what else do the eyes tell us? They can tell us when there's a certain amount of discomfort, and that discomfort can be caused by, for instance, your own struggling with something. Notice how when someone is trying to find the right word to say, or they're processing information that is suddenly troubling, that the eyelids may flutter. This has nothing to do with deception, has nothing to do with truth. It has to do with the fact that oftentimes people's eyelids will flutter when they're confronted with something that's a conundrum, when they're confronted with something that is troubling, when they are confronted with something that they're trying to perfect, and they can't seem to find the right word or the right definition or the right thing to say. So we can use this information in our daily lives as we talk to someone and we ask them questions or they're communicating with us and we see that they are struggling with something they're about to say. And this is an opportunity for us to maybe give them a little extra time so that they can find the right word, so that they can process that information. Or it can also reveal to us that this particular subject is something that they're struggling with. Maybe they don't like to talk about it. I remember years ago I was giving a lecture to a major organization here in the United States. And close by in the audience were some of the executives from that organization. And at the time I was talking about industrial espionage and workplace violence and a variety of different subjects that were of interest to this organization. And I remember I came to a part in the conversation. I had been assessing my audience ever so carefully. And I came to a section where I began to talk about workplace harassment. And I remember in the audience there was a young woman, perhaps in her 30s, and as I began to talk about the different kinds of workplace harassment that we were seeing, some of it involving the internet, some of it involving electronic devices and other things, I noticed that her eyes began to flutter, and she tucked her chin down a few inches. And when the discussion was over, I made my way over to her, and in private I said, "This has been an issue for you, has it not?" And she pointed out to me how she had been victimized in her previous company by someone within the organization. And she was still processing that pain. She couldn't help herself. And you could see it in her eyes as her eyelids were fluttering. And so here's an opportunity that I had to observe someone, detect that there was an issue there from this eye behavior, and then to act on that information. And so I suggested to her, have you talked to someone in human resource? Because maybe this new organization has someone available that could deal with this. And I bring this up because oftentimes we see behaviors, but we don't act on them. We see the elderly person in the store who is standing still, arms tightly wrapped around their chest, maybe stroking their neck, and they're overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed with the store. They're overwhelmed with any number of things. They may be going through anxiety. And no one is observing this because they haven't been taught that all behavior has meaning. And what an opportunity for an employee to see a situation like that and to step forward and say, "May I help you?" and to assist someone who clearly is nonplussed and their bodies are transmitting this information in real time to the rest of us.